Please be seated. The court is now in session. I know that International Defense Counsel for Nuon Chea is on his feet. You may proceed, counsel.
Thank you, Mr. President, and my apologies to the prosecution for interrupting their questioning. I know everyone is tired, so I'll be as brief as possible. But my question relates to our questioning of Professor Chandler later, and I would like to receive some guidance from the trial chamber because I do not want to violate any of the orders as set by you. And they relate to your decision to not accept our documents under Rule 87/4. To be clear, we do not want to revisit that decision at this moment, but we want to get some clarification on its consequence, so in order not to violate your specific orders. The point is that we understand your position that they cannot be admitted as evidence or cannot be considered to be put before the chamber under Rule 87/4, but we want to know if and how we can rely on the contents of those documents, the substantive contents. And the reason I bring this up is because in an earlier decision on a request by Yang Sari, you have ruled that several documents that do not satisfy the test of 87/4 can still be relied on for the contents of their the contents of these documents in order to question this witness. So our question would be, can we in any way use the contents of those documents in order to formulate questions to Professor Chandler? And I must say, as a slight addition to this request for clarification, we have, by filing that Rule 87/4 request, tried to comply with your trial chamber's earlier ruling that we need to do so in order to be able to impeach a witness using quote-unquote new documents. And I don't want to sound too miserable, but we do have the feeling that we just cannot get it right. We have tried to comply with your ruling. We have filed a request, as especially Judge Lavergne seemed to insist on. And these documents are relevant. Again, we will not attempt to put them before the chamber to constitute evidence under 87/4, but we do need to rely on these documents in order to effectively question this witness, and not using these documents would impede our possibilities to do so. So our question simply is, can we rely on the contents of the documents? And I guess I can also add that if we cannot rely on the contents of these documents, I would like some guidance as to how to deal with information that is now, let's say, in the public conscience of my defense team. We have read this stuff. We cannot erase this from our minds. And if you give us some guidance as to how to proceed if we cannot rely on these documents altogether, I would be grateful. Thank you.
The chamber hands over the floors to Judge Sylvia Cartwright in order to respond to defense counsel for Mr. Nunchie. Judge Cartwright, you may proceed.
Thank you, President. The trial chamber appreciates the manner in which counsel raised this matter and wishes to respond as follows. As recently as the 16th of July, through memorandum with the number E172/24/4/4, addressed to the Ieng Sari defence team, this matter was dealt with at paragraph 5. And I'll just read it out again, precisely what the Chamber said in response to the Ieng Sari application, because it applies to the Nuon Chia team as well, of course. So I'm quoting, "It bears emphasising that while the Chamber did not consider the remainder of the documents to which E172/24/4 refers to meet the Internal Rule 87(4) criteria, this decision clearly states that there is no barrier to the Ieng Sari defence calling on their contents when formulating questions to the expert, where the Ieng Sari defence provides advance courtesy copies of this material to the chambers and the other parties. As the Ieng Sari defence has since provided the ERNs for the relevant documents on the shared materials drive, this latter condition has been satisfied." End of quote. So is that a sufficient response to enable you to plan for your questioning?
Thank you, Judge Cartwright. That is crystal clear. And just for the record, I would then like to state that we have, in fact, uploaded all the documents that we would like to rely on, so they are accessible to all the parties in this courtroom. But the message is clear. Thank you.
The President. The floor is now handed over to the international co-prosecutors to continue his line of questioning to this expert.
Thank you, Mr. President. If I may, two very brief housekeeping matters. One for my and Professor Chandler's benefit. We were requested during the break to both speak more slowly. I'll do my best, and I apologise on behalf of both of us, to particularly the interpreters and those listening in Khmer and French. It is simply our wish to get through a lot of material fairly quickly, but if you could slow down a little bit, Professor Chandler, I'll do the same. And secondly, Your Honours, I meant to raise this before the break, and I apologise for not doing so. Simply a matter of scheduling and timing. We were... And I just want to put before you our understanding of where we're at, so perhaps the Chamber can consider it at the next, when we break for the next session. We were allocated 2.5 days, which in real time amounts to approximately 12 hours, if my maths are correct. By the end of today, we will have done less than 7 hours, or close to 7 hours, leaving about a bit over 5 hours tomorrow, which would take up the entire day. I just say that so that Your Honours, if possible, can consider it before we come back and give us your instructions. We will do our utmost, as far as the prosecution is concerned, to finish early tomorrow, by the end of the first session, give or take a short amount of time. I hope the defence will also be accommodating, particularly in light of all of the procedural issues that have arisen and caused delays. And now I will return to my examination. Professor Chandler, thank you again for coming back, and I realise it's late in the day as counsel for Nguyen Chia indicated, everybody's a little bit tired, so we do appreciate you continuing to assist us and answering questions on a fairly complex subject matter. There is really only one remaining subtopic on the issue of the institutions of democratic Kampuchea that I wish to touch upon before moving on to yet another topic. And the issue I wish to touch upon is the resignation of Norodom Sihanouk in March and April 1976, or the events surrounding that resignation. You've dealt with it in some detail in Brother Number 1, E3/17, and the relevant passages in Khmer 00821775, in English 00393 I'm only pointing to those passages so that everybody has them available, because you have actually discussed in those passages the documents which I will be showing you. So perhaps we can speed things up by going straight to the source documents, and if need be, we can refer back to the book. Professor, the events took place in the first half of March, as reported by the documents, and the first document that relates is a standing committee minute dated the 11th of March 1976. It is dated the 11th of March, but it deals with events on the 11th and on the 13th. It is document number E3/197. And the agenda on the first page is indicated as Sihanouk's resignation. We will go to a passage which is of interest to us today. This is at Khmer ERN 0000744, English ERN 001826638, and French ERN 00334961. I understand you've just been given an English translation of that particular passage. And the text is as follows. I will read it in English for the benefit of those who don't have a hard copy. If we could place the Khmer version on the screen for Khmer readers, that would be appreciated. This is topic number 3, Professor Chandler. Opinions of Angkar, meeting on the evening of the 13th. Comrade Hem reported to the Standing Committee on the Sihanouk problem. He has decided absolutely to resign his position. He explained that Angkar should take pity on him, that he would even crawl and show the gesture of respect. Whatever, just let him resign. This resignation is not done in opposition to us. The next passage, Comrade Secretary explained that this problem is a major one. Leave it for our centre to decide. But the Comrade Secretary outlined the principal ideas on which the entire Standing Committee had already agreed as follows. Number 1, do not leave Sihanouk. I apologize. Number 1, do not let Sihanouk leave, in square brackets, the country. This is the first measure. And number 2, must convene the Cabinet of Ministers, report to the Cabinet of Ministers to decide, then go meet with Sihanouk again, with Pen Nut participating. There are two more brief passages that I wish to deal with or read through and then come back to some questions, Professor. Further down, as we continue the same topic, there is section B, which starts as follows, and it's a discussion of the resignation, it appears. Quote, "He joined with our revolution, even though he had conflicts with us. This is why the party has decided for him to be chairman of the Presidium of State, but he did not agree. So whether he stays or goes, it is his matter. We keep him as a dignitary. We do not kill him. But for the nation and the people, he bears serious guilt in his status of a killer of the people. Therefore, our decision is reasonable in every way. We will maintain him, but if he keeps on struggling to free himself, we must end it." The next passage starts with a number 5. "The direction of the development of the revolution, we must end feudalism, just like this. The chess game has gotten to that point. The entire feudalist regime has been permanently smashed and dug out by the revolution. The kings existing over 2,000 years must, in the end, be clean. We have no way out other than this one." Professor, looking at those deliberations and, of course, your research into the events and the policies of the party centre, could you, or are you able to opine about that last passage where, having looked at the position of Norodom Sihanouk, the party centre discusses ending feudalism and 2,000 years of kings existing in the country? What, if anything, does that represent in terms of party direction or party policy?
Well, they simply wanted to get him out of the way. What had happened, one of the reasons they had hung on to him so long and why he had felt able to hang on to them was the survival of his friend Zhou Enlai in Beijing. And when Zhou Enlai died, Sihanouk lost his support, his direct support in China. Very important to the Khmer Rouge, the Chinese angle. But they felt that it was perfectly safe to remove him from any positions of power and lock him up. I mean, the struggle against feudalism, and which is a euphemism for royalty generally in the CPK writings, required them to stop giving Sihanouk the privileges that had been valuable at the time of the beginning of the revolution, the beginning of the alliance in 70 and so forth. Very important for him to be maintained for the outside world, and for some people in Cambodia, inside Cambodia, this last number has been cut way back or pushed way up, depending on what your political views are. That there were millions of them or very few, we don't know. But having him in the picture was not helpful to them. It looks as if Sihanouk, in his request there at the beginning, reported by Q Simpan, was terrified of being killed, I think that's with justice, and was willing to just give up all responsibility, so there was no problem with him. And so Comrade Secretary Pol Pot decided this was an appropriate way to proceed with the continuing, perpetual war against feudalism that the party was always been dedicated to.
Just when you say the Comrade Secretary had decided to proceed in this particular way, does that mean that this decision is different from the collective decision-making that you discussed yesterday?
Not really. I mean, he has the overriding vote. He listens to the discussion, but then can override. He's got a veto power over the discussion. I'm pretty sure that people were just in the room, just waiting to see what he was going to say. None of them are on record as supporting Sihanouk's continuing presence. But this was a kind of a prime ministerial thing to do against a former chief of state. There's a status. You can't have a minor cabinet minister making the policy, so this is appropriate. I think I'm sure the Standing Committee agreed with all of this. There's never been any echoes later on that they wanted him to play any more of an active role in Cambodia.
Thank you. And before we leave this topic entirely, I wish to briefly look at a document dated the 4th of April 1976, so this is within less than a month. It's another FIBIS transcript. The document number is E3/275. Unfortunately not available in Khmer or French. In English, the ERN is 00167-605, and we do have a hard copy, Professor. This is a different page. This is attributed to Mr. Q Sampan. It is a Phnom Penh domestic service on the 4th of April 1976 broadcast of that service, and it is entitled Statement of the Government of Democratic Cambodia on the request by Chief of State Norodom Sihanouk for retirement, read by Deputy Prime Minister Q Sampan, presumably live. I just wish to read, in fact, if we look on the screen, I will read just below that square. The Council of Ministers realises that Samdech Norodom Sihanouk is a monarch with a high sense of patriotism who has actively contributed to the struggle for national liberation against the most ferocious war of aggression of the US imperialists and their lackeys. Part 3 of the resolution of the National Congress, dated the 27th of April 1975, clearly noted the good deeds of Samdech and solemnly proclaimed to maintain the status of Samdech Norodom Sihanouk as Chief of State in the new phase of Cambodia's history and in the new Cambodian society. But Samdech wishes to retire, so he will have time for the private life of his family after having conducted political activities for 35 years. And the last sentence, the Council of Ministers has expressed regret over the request for retirement by Samdech Norodom Sihanouk. However, out of respect for the highest wishes of Samdech, the Council of Ministers has decided to approve the request for retirement. Again, Professor Chandler, in light or on the basis of your research and studies into these events, does this reported decision of the Council of Ministers reflect a policy that was at the time in place in relation to Norodom Sihanouk?
Yes, it would if we hadn't seen the previous document. I mean, the previous document says what the policy was going to be, which was just to lock him up, and we're doing the right thing not to kill him. And he's been an enemy of the state for basically 35 years, enemy of the people for 35 years. It's important to know that these FBIS broadcasts, the translations are, people have seen some of the original Khmer. They're very good. They're very good. They were very good translations. But they were targeted. Cambodia was not full of people listening to the radio. These broadcasts were targeted for, to a large extent, for overseas, and also for, perhaps for the semi-education of cadre who might be a little bit confused about Sihanouk's status. So they don't want to make an official announcement saying we don't like him, we threw him out. They have this kind of like a front in front of the party. It's a front announcement that's pleasing to the listeners and convinces people overseas, or attempts to convince people overseas who had no access to these other documents, that this is a rational regime who's friendly and indeed almost honoring this figure who's been basically the only person most of the world has ever heard of when they think of Cambodia. So, yeah, I mean, that's my answer. It's a fascinating document for those reasons. If you see the two of them, you can see what they're doing. It's interesting.
Thank you, Professor. And we move on now to another topic, and it is the topic of the alleged policy regarding real or perceived enemies of the party. And in this section, we will deal to some extent with S21, although as it is not currently part of this first trial, and we have been directed not to delve into great detail of the inner workings. So we are focusing on the policy and the broad outlines of its implementation. Just by way of a general introduction, so that we have a logical place to start, could you, in 2 minutes or less, describe for us the establishment of S21, based on your research, the time of the establishment of the facility, and its basic description, if you could?
An institution called S21 was established quite early in the regime. I forget the exact month. It was sometime in the latter part of 1975. For a while, it was situated in the psychiatric hospital in Takmao, other times in old police headquarters. Its tasks, as far as can be determined, a lot of these early records have disappeared, were to find and root out some of the former members of the Lon Nol regime, and perhaps also some foreigners, minority people, some of the early traders, things like that they just thought would not be. But it was not systematic. The records weren't kept in a systematic way. In April 76, which I said earlier was this turning point, this darkening shunt of the Cambodian government, that's when they started to be convinced that there were enemies inside the party, particularly from the eastern zone, who'd been responsible for some grenade explosion in Phnom Penh. There was no evidence of casualties. And soon after that, Kankek Eo Duik was put in command of a new facility, a high school that many people in the room have visited as the Tuol Sleng Museum of Genocidal Crimes. That opened up in May in this former high school, and soon after that, prisoners began to pour in for interrogation, and as it turned out, which was not, we're not quite sure if this was true of the early S21, certainly was of the subsequent one, the one in Tuol Sleng, for interrogation, in many cases torture, all cases interrogation, some cases torture, and in all cases execution.
Thank you. And just a couple more questions on the facility itself. I don't want to go into any great detail here, just to set the basics in place. Apart from that location that you describe in Phnom Penh High School, did the facility also use any other locations, or was that the only one that you've come across in your research?
That was the only one that bore that number. An affiliated facility at Prey Saw was called S24. This was more of a re-education facility, although some people were moved from there into S21 if they were thought to be more serious offenders than they'd been thought to be when they were brought in. And Prey Saw, ironically or not, was the political prison in the Lon Nol regime. So it was an existing prison facility, unlike the high school in Tuol Sleng.
Now, looking at your book, which deals with the facility, Voices from S21, and the D number for this document is D108/50/1.4.6. You discuss, among many other things, the mission of the facility, and I wish to look at that passage briefly. The Khmer ERN is 001918445-46. The English ERN is 00192693694, and French 00357277278. If we could pass a hard copy to the professor, and if we could also display the Khmer text on the screen for the Khmer readers in court and in the public gallery. In this passage, Professor Chandler, you state the following: the country was administered by a handful of politically obsessive men and women, many of them former school teachers, who saw it as their long-term duty to oversee, punish, and transform the people under their control. The cadre in charge of S21, in turn, were under the surveillance of the party centre, in brackets, Mochim Pak, similarly concealed from you, and as members of an independent regiment, they worked under military discipline. A little bit further down in the same passage, there are the following sentences. Its mission was to protect the party centre. It accomplished this task, in part, by killing all the prisoners, and in part by altering their autobiographies to align them with the requirements and suspicions of the party. Professor, if I could ask you to expand on your conclusion that the centre's mission was to protect the party centre. How did you arrive at that conclusion? And if you could describe, perhaps in more detail, what points to the mission?
I'm not sure about your last phrase. At what point in the mission? What does that mean?
I'm sorry, probably misspoke. I just meant to say what points to the mission. What evidence and what you considered in coming to that conclusion about the mission to protect the party centre. And if if I could just remind both of us to proceed slowly.
I mean, this mission shows up, I think it was taken for granted by Deutsch, who had already had a previous job in the Amleang Center during the Civil War. It was to protect the center and to locate and basically sweep clean, which is the Cambodian phrase for purge, opponents or perceived opponents to the regime. Obviously, it purged some real opponents to the regime, but examination of the confessions makes it impossible to determine which these people were. So you have to say, I think, generally these were perceived opponents. It was also a point I made in the book that I drew from my colleague Stephen Heder, and I think it makes very good sense, was that one of the another supplementary purpose of the place was to provide the party center with a history of not only opposition to the party, but also to the extermination of that opposition on a continuous basis. In other words, it's horrible to use these images, but as a kind of a cleaning mechanism is always in operation. Your opponents are always being punished. Your views are always being supported, and so on. This is it's a guess. They never used, but there are parallels with the Soviet experience of the history being the history of the Stalin's history of the Communist Party is the story of his overcoming his enemies. I think this may have been a distant model. That's how they conceived history, was punishing enemies. So it was a very consistent, very deep notion that the center had to be protected and that these people who had strayed or had pushed, or whatever word you want to use, into S-21, rather like Sihanouk in a way, could never be allowed to come out of that institution. They couldn't go out into the street and say where they'd been or what had happened to them. They had to be demolished or smashed, as they said.
And considering that mission as you describe it, if we consider the issue of re-education, which we have discussed a little bit as we've gone through the various topics, in your opinion, is there a relationship, and please tell me if there isn't any, between the concepts of, on the one hand, re-education, and on the other, the concept of smashing the enemy?
No, there's really no direct relationship. These are two procedures that were thought to be available when you were confronted with a perceived enemy. If some of the evidence was contradictory or ambiguous, the person was considered to be an appropriate candidate for re-education. If not, it was a candidate for execution. Now, here's a place, interesting enough, where the Cambodians just deviated very sharply from the Chinese model that they followed in so many other ways. There have been attempts to pin Chinese policies onto S-21. The Chinese were relentlessly concerned with re-education. This could take, in some cases, 20 or 30 years, just a process. The Cambodians did very little in this regard. There's very little formal re-education, except among, ironically perhaps, party members who were constantly being taken to these study sessions, improved, criticize themselves, apply the discipline, and become better party members. But they talk about re-education, but it doesn't happen at S-21, because if it did, people would be released. There was some re-education, I think, at S-24. People were given lectures, and they gave lectures. They apologized. The photographer for S-21, there was a blotch on a photograph of Pol Pot, and people said he'd put the blotch there, but he said no, it was in the negative, and so he was released from S-24. nobody was released from S-21.
And just focusing for a brief moment on the idea of people not being released. You said yesterday that you had interviewed some of the survivors from S-21. Based on the information, data, documents you've reviewed and people you've interviewed, how many survivors were there when the regime was toppled? And if you're not sure in the exact terms, you can give us a range.
It seems to have been about a dozen, and including some children. One of these people has recently surfaced as a middle-aged grown-up. He was there as a child of one of the other prisoners who was killed. Many of these people have passed away in recent years. I think there's, to my knowledge, there's only 2 survivors left. But active survivors, about a dozen in 1979 that came to the surface. The Vietnamese were quite assiduous in finding these people, not only to provide them data about how S-21 used to work, but also to provide anti-Pol Pot propaganda. And so these people were sought out, treated fairly well, and were so I think, in other words, they located all the survivors. They were treated well. The survivors came to them and were given jobs and salaries and so forth.
Now, if we take a brief look at documents discovered at S-21, could you give us a brief overview of the types and volume of documents discovered?
By far the greatest proportion of documents are so-called confessions. And these documents were very interesting in many ways for me to get voices coming out of the facility. I didn't use these as evidence for genuine historical events, except in some cases for biographical information that could be confirmed by other sources. But the material that was most useful in an analytical way were the administrative documents at the prison, including handbook of instructions, considering political work with prisoners, which is a word for interrogation, study sessions that were held by the cadre at the facility. I did use, I must say, confessions by members of the staff, because I felt that although most of the confessions can be assumed to be a tissue of lies, it seems to me these guards and so on who were arrested at S-21 for offenses, when they confessed to offenses, they were talking to people who probably knew that these offenses had actually occurred. So I used some of that as information about how the place worked, confessions by former employees, or by employees who later became, by getting killed, former employees. Now, what comes through, particularly the diaries of some of the chief interrogators are very interesting, and I use them a lot. This will gives you a window into the way these people saw their work, the way they saw the revolution, and the kind of dedication they brought to their work, which I think a lot of this showed up in case one. I'm going to go back to it, but this was a very dedicated bunch of people who were in charge of this horrific, but in an odd sense, quite logical operation, which was to sweep clean on a continuous basis the party's enemies out of just keep cleaning up the country. I'm sorry, the country at the top levels. These were chosen people. There were prisons all over the country, other detention centers. A lot of this information has come out after I wrote this book, but they were not, party cadre did not get imprisoned in those places. this place is pretty much limited to people who were either members of the party or soldiers or employees at ministries. They were government or party people at S21.
Thank you. Now, because we're not concerned with the day-to-day workings of the prison at this hearing, I won't go into a great amount of detail on the documentation, other than just to ask you one question. You said you have reviewed confessions. Could you describe for the court what these documents look like? Are they separated into sections? Are they written, handwritten, typed? How long are they, etc.?
Well, only about. I've had the figure. I've had the figure back in my room actually, but I think it's like 3,800 were found at S21. Another 300 or 400 found somewhere else. We know the prison. Everybody had said for years the prison held 14,000 people until case one said 13,000, whatever, 478. So around 14,000. So a lot of the prisoners who went through there, the two alternatives. They either didn't produce confessions. There's some evidence that many people were trucked in and trucked right out to execution sites. Or there are three possibilities. The second is that their confession has just not been discovered. It was just lost in the chaos of the late 70s. And the third is that these confessions have been culled, presumably by the authorities at PRK, who found that because there are Vietnamese notes on many of the confessions. Vietnamese cadre, fluent in Khmer, went through these confessions to see what was going on. They're very historically minded. And I'm just convinced that a lot of the confessions were pulled at that stage, but we don't know which ones they were, of course. So we've got 4,000. They're very different in the sense that the high party cadre ones are very long. Some of them have 800, 300, 400 pages, going for 2 or 3 months of interrogation. Some of the minor soldiers and a lot of those are handwritten by the men, mostly men themselves. The soldiers' ones are briefer. They're usually typed. And these are real falsifications in the sense I couldn't have time to do all the work. But I found paragraphs in different confessions that are absolutely identical. They're typed out just a standard kind of soldier's confession. This is what you put in them and then move it forward. Pretty much, probably the soldier didn't say this stuff. It just got typed. One extraordinary footnote to S21, which I think is kind of indicative of DK. I've never found a typing mistake. Not a single one. These typists were good and they were frightened because typing mistakes would be on purpose. So the documents are very neatly prepared. They're easy to read in that sense. The Khmer is not wildly complicated. But they're a daunting bunch of documents because these people don't know what's going to happen. They're not told what's going to happen. So they're struggling to survive, and they're not told they won't. But as I was working, I knew every one of these people had been executed, so it gave it a kind of a horrible flavor to the study, that's all.
And just if we can augment that very comprehensive answer with a description of the form, or rather the structure of the confessions, if there was a common structure.
Yeah, pretty much they started with an autobiography. The autobiography would give facts about the person, his parents, his birthplace, and so on. Then his class origins, class relationship. Then his history of activity in the party, if there was such a history. And this was in common with all autobiographies, which everybody had to prepare. All the employees prepared follow the same format in their autobiographies that they presented to their people in charge of them. Following that came two things. One was the history of my treasonous activities, and this was the actual confession, where they confessed to various offenses, which are cataloged in my book. Some of the offenses are wildly absurd. Some are maybe so, you don't know. And then finally, in many confessions, particularly the important people, list of associates. And this would long strings, they were called ksai, long strings of people. Sometimes you get the impression that this person is just spinning out all the names he knows. Other times more conscientious. In many cases, some of these people are brought in to S21 because they've been, I think the rule was, showed up in one of the interviews, that it was 3. If you're cited in 3 confessions, there's authority to go out to wherever you are and pull you in. If 3 people had named this person. So what you find, obviously, if it's the closer you get to the center of the party, the more and more duplication you get. So the thing rolls up out of control. But that's they didn't predict this. So generally, these things are fairly standard format. Now, often in 1 or 2 sessions, now the important people like Von Vet and Khoi Thuan and some of these people, they were interrogated for days on end and produced a confession that was then put aside, and the people gave out, now tell us the right story. Oh, so the person would write out another story that he thought might meet the requirements. No. Now we really want the truth, another 50 pages contradicting the preceding. And so they really thought they were getting toward a true story. And actually what they were getting, I would just say, they were getting a document from a person who was just getting completely had no sense of what was wanted or what the truth was even.
Thank you.
The President. Thank you, all parties. The time is now appropriate to adjourn for the day. However, the chamber needs some time to consult with the President. Thank you, parties. The time is now appropriate to adjourn for the day. However, the Chamber needs some time to discuss with parties involved concerning the schedule for examination of Professor David Chandler. And in addition, we observe that Professor David Chandler has made his level best to respond to all the questions put to him. And in order to ensure that he can continue to provide his testimony before us, we should adjourn a bit earlier. But we would like to inform Professor David Chandler that the examination of your testimony is not yet concluded, so we would like to invite you to come to testify again tomorrow. And court officer is instructed to arrange the transport and the accommodation for Professor Chandler, and please have him back before 9 o'clock in the morning. Then, Professor, you may now be released for the day, and we will resume the examination tomorrow morning from 9 o'clock. The President, is there any issue from the prosecution you may raise?
Mr. President, I apologize sincerely for interrupting. It is just because we're about to release Professor Chandler that I just wanted to make 2 requests in relation to documents that we would like him to review for tomorrow, simply to ensure that everybody is prepared. And if I may, Professor, if you could, to the extent that you're able to, review the annotations on the set of confessions you were given by the prosecution, and if you're able to consider the sources on the status of Mr. Q Sampan in relation to the Central Committee. It was one of the issues that we discussed, and you were not able to recall the sources you relied upon. I do apologize, Mr. President. I just wanted to make sure we got those points across before the Professor leaves.
The President, yes, Mr. Professor Chandler, you may now leave the room. The President. Now I would like to ask the prosecution as to how much time do you anticipate to put the question to Professor David Chandler.
Mr. President, I believe we need between 1.5 and 2 hours tomorrow. I'm more than happy to conclude in less than 2 hours. I'm very apprehensive about giving an exact estimate because we haven't asked the questions. But if 1.5 to 2 hours could be allocated to us, we would be most grateful.
The President, thank you. How about the civil party lead co-lawyers?
Yes, Mr. President, thank you for this question. Well, by saying 5 hours, I might have been a bit ambitious. I think 3 or 3.5 hours should suffice. Thank you. But yeah, 3.5 hours is a minimum, I should also say.
The President. Thank you. After having heard of the request by the prosecution and the civil party lead co-lawyers, the Chamber now decides that the first half of the morning session is granted to the prosecution, and the second half of the morning session will be awarded to the civil party lead co-lawyers. The reason is that we have spent a lot of time on various issues yesterday and this morning, so this shall be the most reasonable decision for the time to be given to the parties. It is now appropriate for us to adjourn for today, and we adjourn now, and we will resume the proceedings tomorrow morning on the 20th of July 2012 from 9 o'clock in the morning. The proceedings will begin with the prosecution continuing their questionings to the expert David Chandler, to be followed by civil party lead co-lawyers. Security guards are now instructed to take the accused persons to the detention facility and return them by 9 o'clock. Yes, Mr. Canavas, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a point of clarification. It would appear then that the civil parties only have the rest of the morning session and not the afternoon. At least that's how it came across on the English translation. So I assume that you meant the rest of the day, but I'm not here to challenge you, but I'm just pointing that out.
The President. Two parties will put questions to the experts tomorrow. The first one is the prosecution, that who will take the first half of the morning session. And the second half of the morning session and the afternoon session will be provided to the civil party co-lead lawyers. The defense teams will commence their question to the experts on Monday next week.
សូមចេញក្រៅឆ្នាំ